So our first storyteller is named Al Kuhn. And it was last January that across the street, we did a workshop with teenagers interviewing senior citizens. And we had one more senior than we had teens to do the interviews. And I was so lucky because I got Al to interview. So I heard this amazing story, and I really enjoyed listening to him. And when it got time to create this event, I called him up to see if he would tell the story here. And I totally expected him to say, oh, I've never done anything like that before. I'm not a storyteller. But he paused for a moment. He says, what's the date again? November 9th? I'm already telling a story that day. So, I mean, you'll meet him. He doesn't look like a professional actor. But what it turned out is that this story that gripped me from the beginning started on Kristallnacht, which was a horrible night in Nazi Germany when people were allowed to really vandalize and do harm to Jewish businesses and homes throughout the country. And the reason he was already booked is because it turned out the date I'd selected for this event is the same date as Kristallnacht in 1938. So I guess that 76 years ago today, his story began. So without any more introduction, Al, come on up.
Thank you, Elliot. As Elliot graciously introduced me, I am an immigrant. When I grew up abroad, I never, ever thought the day would come when I would immigrate to the United States and help America land a man on the moon. So I'll start at the beginning, and this is my story for today. I am a Jew. I was born in Germany in 1934, just after the Nazis came to power. My family, my parents, were merchants, successful, living in a small town in absolutely the center of Germany. If you put a pin, it's like Kansas. But unlike Kansas, this was an area of rolling hills and meadows, a well-known forest, and a bunch of lakes. And most important, it was far, far away from the big cities in Germany. So my parents and every other Jew in town thought, well, the Nazis will not really bother us. We were all wrong. Right after the Nazis came to power, they started to make edicts. People were kicked out of public office. People could no longer have civil service jobs. No teaching, no librarian, not even a dog catcher. Couldn't be an actor, couldn't work in a theater. We're not even allowed to play in an orchestra. Edict after edict came. And to make it short, Jews were kicked out, expelled from the stock exchange, and later on, they were prohibited from practicing law and medicine. Other rules came, trivial perhaps. Jews were not allowed to have any more pets. Crazy. Jews were not allowed to go to public parks or go to the public swimming pools. And it got worse. It came the time where Jews were not allowed to own any more property. I still remember when my father had to give up his car, and later on we had to give up the house we lived in. Under these circumstances, it was no wonder that we and many other Jews tried to immigrate to the United States. And around 1938, my parents applied for the proper documents. And then one day, exactly as Elliot said, 76 years ago today, November the 9th, 1938, a day which became known as Kristallnacht, what came about. The Germans, the Nazis, had organized throughout the country, and Austria, which was at that time part of Germany, a movement to really attack all Jews, destroy Jewish establishments, burn down a synagogue, and do whatever harassment they could come up with. My personal story is very simple. there was a knock on our door late at night. A policeman told us to come down to downtown City Hall, from where all the Jews in our community were taken to the county center, to the courthouse, and we were all placed into a very large room, the size of a gymnasium, in the basement of that courthouse. Men on one side, women and children on the other. And the processing began and continued throughout the night. Early in the morning, the verdict came in. All men were arrested for a crime of being Jewish, and immediately sent to concentration camp in Germany. Women and children were set free, allowed to go back home. When we arrived back in our house, which was located on the main street of our little town called Barschfeld an die Weser, nobody ever heard of it, our house was next door to the local synagogue, and the synagogue was attached to the local inn. So the Nazis were not allowed to burn down the synagogue because the innkeeper was afraid for his own establishment. They did the next best thing, or worst thing. They totally ransacked the synagogue, smashed every window, broke everything, ripped up anything that could burn, the curtains, the prayer books, the holy Torahs, the wooden pews and benches, and all the cushions which were there where people sat on, and put them outside and set a bonfire, literally in front of our house. And when the flames reached the cushions, the feathers inside blew up with the flames, and for 1 or 2 days, it rained down feathers. 2 days, all this many years afterwards. When I see a little white feather, it reminds me of that day. During this time, we finally got the papers required to immigrate to this country. But there was a catch. And the catch was, in addition to the visa, you had a number, a quota system. And our number was like 3 years downstream. It would have been absolutely too late. My father, while he was in concentration camp, heard of a Swiss entrepreneur who was starting a European-style dairy farm in the jungles of Bolivia in South America. And when my father was released, and he was among the first Jewish group to be released, thanks to a document that he had with him, which proved that he was a veteran fighting for the Germans in World War I, we applied to go to that farm. The only requirement was you had to be a farmer. Now, my parents were merchants, but they lied, and they got accepted. Finally, in 1940, about 7 months after World War II had started, we were able to leave our town. We boarded a train, and parenthetically, my family and I were the last, absolutely last Jews to get out of town. Every Jewish person who was still there eventually perished in the Holocaust. Not a single one survived. We took a train south through Austria to Italy, to the port of Genoa, where we were going to board a steamship. While we were waiting in Genoa, my parents bought my sister and me, each a present. My sister got a beautiful doll, which she named Bianca, after the name of the ship we were going to sail on, the Conte Biancamano. I got an erector set, which I played with the rest of my childhood. And actually, this is the only toy that I ever had, but I remember it well. We boarded the ship. It took a long time, almost 4 weeks, to get to our destination. We sailed through the Atlantic Ocean, through the Panama Canal, down the Pacific, the west coast of South America, and we got off in Arica, Chile. From there, we took a train up over the Andes to La Paz, Bolivia, which is quite high up. And to get to the farm, the only way you could get there was on a very narrow road, one-lane dirt road on the side of mountains. It's called the deadliest road in the world, still today. It's called the Yungas Road. And we were sitting on top of a truck, 4-wheel drive, didn't exist yet. And we drove for about 6 hours. The truck stopped at a certain place. We were told to get off, and there's a bunch of mules on the side. So we were told to hop on these mules. And literally, the mules had no saddles, just a blanket. And again, we went up the side of a steep mountain. And we finally, after an hour or so, got to our farm. The farm was very large, but very crude. First of all, it was on the slope of a mountain. No electricity, no running water, no indoor toilet facilities. Food was marginal. We lived from what was grown on the land. For a kid, it was fun, but not a chance of any education, not a school within 50 kilometers, no medical attention. So after about a year, my parents finally revolted and said, we cannot live like this anymore. And they got an agreement with the proprietor to move back to La Paz. My father remained in La Paz selling the products of the farm. It took us about 10 years in Bolivia before we got the next set of immigration papers, and we finally got to America. And we landed or arrived in Worcester, Massachusetts, because my father had relatives there. At that time, Worcester had a very interesting system. Every immigrant, no matter what country came from, had to go to a special school, A, to learn English, B, to learn American history, and being in Massachusetts, learn all about local Massachusetts history. I learned all about Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrims. I learned all about Paul Revere and the Boston Tea Party. I learned about the Adams families, and I began to know the Red Sox, which became my favorite team for many years. I got out of that school after about 3 months, finished junior high school in Worcester, and then my folks and I moved to the Bronx in New York, where I went to high school. During this time, I became very interested in science and technology. And science fiction at the time was thinking about spaceships going to the moon and to Mars and other places. And I read voraciously on the subject. I must have talked a lot about it too, because I remember in my high school yearbook, which I still have, it says, among many other things, Al, please send us a postcard when you arrive on the moon. I got to point out, this was years before the space age ever began. Anyhow, after school and summers, I worked to get enough money to be able to pay for my college education. I went to New York University, got a degree in aeronautical engineering, and I started to work in the aerospace industry. I actually worked there my entire life. The last 36 years, I worked for a company on Long Island in New York called Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. And we did many, many projects. My initial technical specialty was propulsion and performance, and later on I became a technical manager. I worked on a space orbiting telescope. I worked on a number of large aircraft programs. I even worked on a research submarine. But perhaps the most interesting item I worked on was the vehicle that landed man on the moon. Grumman, I didn't do it myself, but I helped. Grumman got the contract to build the so-called lunar module, which was 2 vehicles, basically one on top of each other. One with a rocket engine to land on the moon, and a second rocket engine to get off from the moon. So I remember, and I'm sure every member in the audience who was around in 1969 remembers when Neil Armstrong and then Buzz Aldrin stepped on the moon on July 20, 1969. However, for me, I was still on pins and needles until the next day, when successfully they lifted off from the moon on my rocket, orbited in rendezvous, and made a successful landing back on Earth. That was probably one of the technical highlights, not only of my career, but of the entire American peaceful progress in the 20th century. Excuse me. I worked for many years in Grumman, and when we retired, I stayed in Long Island with my wife, And until about 5 years ago, we decided to downsize. We sold our house and moved to Palo Alto because our 2 sons and their family lived in Silicon Valley. I still follow technical aircraft and space development continuously. And it's really gratifying that just across the street, across 101, is the NASA Ames Research Center, which is deeply involved in space travel and exploration of the universe. I'll spend about 10 or 12 minutes telling you 80 years of my story. It's really been an adventure, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. Thank you.
It's a pretty amazing trajectory, huh? There's a lot of morals to the story, but I think one of them is to buy your children erector sets. You see what happens.